Dave, I
See,
was so irritated by you when I saw you show up in the dress. I didn't say it at the time. I tried to be, politically correct, and it was exactly for that reason.
all right, everybody, welcome to Theory Underground. We've got Doug Lain back. How you doing, Doug?
I'm doing okay. I just finished the final section of this film that we started last year when we went to the
Oh, good.
conventions.
Yeah.
We went to the Republican and the Democratic Party conventions, and we filmed there. And I've been slowly editing it all together and narrating it. And I just finished the final segment of the narration. Wrote a whole section about Benjamin Studebaker.
Oh, cool.
Uh, yeah, because he's one of the characters in the film. So yeah, that's what I've been doing this morning.
Well, I look forward to that. I've been anticipating it ever since I found out you guys were shooting it. It's pretty cool that
Yeah,
you went to both of those.
yeah, it was interesting. Of the two, I definitely preferred the Republican convention. I have to confess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I bet. I
Yeah.
bet. I don't know. I'm used to being around people who do not agree with me, and I don't really expect them to really understand where I'm coming from, and that's okay. I've come to terms with it. But if I'm going to be around Democrats or Republicans, it can, in a lot of cases, be easier to be around Republicans. And that's weird. It's weird that that's happened because that's not how it was for most of my life. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. The difference between the Republican convention and the Democratic Party convention was that at the convention, people said pretty much what they really thought, and they were having a good time. And at the Democratic Party convention, everyone was extremely uptight,
Yeah.
and they were guarded, and everyone
Mm,
was saying pretty much the same things. If you get them to
right.
be interviewed, it was all, we're very excited. Kamala's young. She's brat. She's a person of color. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay. And everyone said that. We're feeling joy. We're feeling a lot of joy. The thing that we're feeling right now is joy. Also, she's a person of color. She's both black and Indian. So we're excited. Again and again, the same stuff. And it was like, come on. And like the
Say
Republicans
something.
would say anything, you don't know what they're gonna say. They were like painting their faces like the Joker and run around. It was different at the Republican convention.
Yeah, the sort of 1990s I'll say whatever I want attitude has moved across the aisle.
Right. I would say that I'll say whatever I want attitude is a countercultural attitude that goes at least back to the 50s. I mean, it's actually, isn't that just what being an American is?
Yes, it
You
is.
say
It
whatever.
is just being American. Yeah. Yeah, which is a good segue into the actual I don't know. I wanted to talk to you about liberalism, right? And that's the sort of title of or theme of this is liberalism. What you do is sublation media, right? And so let's start there with the idea of sublation and how you advocate for the sublating of some kind of liberalism. Like what I want to get into what kind of liberalism in particular, but let's just start out with the idea of sublation itself.
Well, oh boy. I mean, the idea of sublation is something that I have an okay time like describing in philosophical terms. If I can just lean on like the science of
Alpha
logic
lump,
and
right?
Hegel, right? The beginning of Hegel, so the science of logic. I can walk through a very abstract example of sublation from there. But I don't. I can do that if you'd like. But
Nah.
the idea of sublating society or sublating capitalism, that is much more difficult. It's not just a simple abstract notion. It takes a certain level of. I've come to believe. I think I've always thought, but now working with Catrone on the Catrone zone, he has convinced me that it does require a kind of intuitive judgment to accomplish. I am always a little wary of such categories as intuitive judgment because one person's intuition may be very different than another. So
Right.
I think the idea is not just your intuition, but also your judgment, both. Um, and so
Right. Who's are we talking about the people's intuitive judgment in some democratic sense? Are we talking about a great leader's intuitive judgment? Are we talking about a thinker, some great thinker's intuitive judgment?
I
But
don't think it's none of those. It's none of those. And the reason why the emphasis is on judgment rather than intuition is because it's not an immediate, spontaneous judgment, but it's something that you have to work through and develop through public reason as well as through expression. So it's not, I mean, it's not simply the people's immediate judgment or their immediate intuition, but it's a process of intuiting and judging and creating change. So, but I'm ducking the question. You're asking me about sublating liberalism, right? And
well,
my
and well, it's
intuitive judgment is the way to sublate liberalism is to start with the notion of the thing that defines the left, which is that we should free both individuals and the society that produces them.
right.
That's the aim of socialism, and that is also simultaneously the actual foundational aim of modern societies. That is not countercultural to aim to do that.
It's not countercultural to want to try to maintain, you said,
To
society alongside the individual.
emancipate, free, liberate society and the individual. That is actually the primary aim of modern societies.
The aim of modern societies is to emancipate the individual and the society, and you're saying that's not countercultural.
It's not countercultural.
Yeah, could you, well, I want you to expand on that, but first, can we just so with the sublation concept, I don't want you to have to unpack it from the science of logic, but we're just saying you want to retain something yet overcome it. Is that the simple version?
Yeah. And so, like in the case of, let's say, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in the United States, right? It is originally a revolutionary project aimed at liberating both individuals within society and itself as a sovereign nation of free individuals, right? That is what the United States was founded upon. So so we have to sublate that project because it's gone awry. It's in contradiction with itself. Um, so the way to do that is by not simply by working against the United States as a project, but rather attempting to realize it.
Right.
To say,
Now,
okay, how do we realize this project? What's gone wrong with this original project? But it's not in opposition to socialism. Is not in opposition to the initial uh, revolutionary movements of that created slowly in violent and contradictory ways created the modern world as we know it now. It's not in opposition to it. It's trying to realize the projects of European revolutions, African revolution, Chinese revolution, on the terms that really are fundamental to all of them.
right. And so all of the revolutions that come with modernity or capitalism, you would say, uh, well, not well. I don't know about you're not saying all, are you? But like,
Sure, I would say all in different ways, but yeah, all of the revolutions of modernity or bourgeois society that then set the stage for capitalism, which I think is a contradiction of that society, they all aim at the same fundamental thing, which is to liberate individuals and society so that humanity can be self-directed, autonomous, and free. That is the aim of all of these revolutions.
But some of these revolutions will subjugate the individual to society, whereas other ones will subjugate society to the individual.
Yeah, that happens due to a contradiction within society, due to the way in which we've developed our freedom. The idea of society and the individual, the freedom of society being in opposition to the freedom of the individual, and the freedom of the individual being in opposition to the freedom of society, that arises out of the contradiction in our form of freedom in society, which is, as a Marxist, I would say, the freedom of workers or the freedom of labor, the way in which we set up all of our relationships by the amount of time we spend working, dominating
Yeah.
us.
And that you are free to work or starve and be homeless, but at least you're free to be homeless if you choose to walk out of your job, right?
Sometimes you are. Sometimes you get uh, arrested and taken away or forced out of town, or you're not even necessarily free to be homeless necessarily,
Right.
right?
Yeah. No, in Portland, maybe, you can,
In Portland,
can't.
sometimes you're allowed to be homeless. Right now, it's not that hard. 10, 15 years ago, you would get rousted if you were
Okay.
in the same place on the street for too long. It depends on who's in office and what the rules are.
Right. But you're not going to get sent to a gulag or shot against a wall somewhere because you walk out of your job.
Not directly, no. Probably not.
Yeah. And you don't like various things about some of these other revolutions that have taken place because that was a freedom you didn't have.
I would prefer to live in a society. Yes, that's right. I would prefer to live in a society where individuals had more freedom rather than less, because I
Right.
think that we have to have freedom in society for individuals if we're going to overcome the 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 contradictions that we're facing now. That we can't do this uh, from the vantage point of the state, from the vantage point of the institutions that are set up to basically paper over and maintain this current society. That we can't do it in basically we cannot liberate society and individuals through a counter revolution, through the suppression of society and individuals. That won't work. We have to realize freedom for both. And society is
Right.
not free if the individuals within it are in chains, especially if
Right.
the individuals in it are not just in chains like in a real literal prison, but also are unable to develop their own mind and
Right.
and actions.
So that is the kind of liberalism that has to be sublated, is the liberalism of the individual.
Yes, but right, it has to be sublated, and with that, and people again, I get like oh, it should be sublated. Yes, it should be, but we have to maintain and remember and hold on to the idea that to sublate something does not mean to simply negate it. It does not mean to oppose it. It means to
Right.
realize it.
So I think this is, from maybe my leftist days, one of the reasons that you were one of the few people in the sort of left internet or left YouTube sort of creator space that I was like, I like him, and it was because you were not opposed to individual freedom, and that you actually, and that it was one of the things that I found initially quite off-putting about the left, was this way that, it's about emancipation and freedom of your individuality and your freedom of expression and all of this stuff. But then it seems like that changed pretty quickly to, oh, well, actually, people who care about freedom of speech, you see, they're actually like that's some crypto right ringer kind of thing, like that.
Yeah.
It became like it became sort of suspect to care about freedom of speech. Oh, you just want freedom of speech so people can be racist. Oh, you, and like that was it, that became this sort of reactive mode that I was seeing. And I was like, what is that? And then I was seeing that you take a strong stand in defense of individual liberty, and that you are reasoning with people who, in a lot of cases, aren't convinced that that's very important. And so I see a value in that, and I appreciate it. But I think maybe for people, a lot of my listeners probably aren't even aware of this, right? They haven't spent enough time in these spaces. And so would you say that that's still quite an issue? Do you feel like you're really swimming upstream here? No, we're not just talking about Democrats, we're talking about the left on the internet or whatever.
Um, well, yeah, I mean, let's see. It's different now than it
It is.
was even a year ago, and certainly different now than it was when we met in Idaho, right? And when you first started watching the channel that I was doing for Zero Books.
Mhm.
Why is it different now? Well, now the Democrats are concerned about free speech again. So it
Is
has
that because of
become,
Palestine?
yes,
Okay.
yeah, because what's happened is that Trump has now taken power and is opposing the rights of some individuals in society in the name of national security, and because it's coming from Trump or the opposite party, the Democrats are taking up the task of defending speech again, and not in a straightforward, consistent way. But the Republicans didn't really defend free speech in a straightforward, consistent way when they were out of power either. But rather, they are concerned about it. And so, like when I went recently to a panel in Corvallis to talk about the free speech question with two other leftists, there was not disagreement on the panel, and there might have been based on what I was saying 2 years ago. There might have been someone, at least one person on the panel. I mean, it was difficult for a real leftist to very openly and directly say they were opposed to free speech in the abstract, but there might have been more of a ambivalence about it than there was on this panel. And again, that was because they saw the free speech issue in terms of the suppression of left ideas,
Right.
left projects. And so now, because the left saw itself as being suppressed and it could really point to real world examples, it was much easier to be for free speech, even for society overall and individuals within society overall. So there was a different problem that I was trying to raise at that on that panel that was not fully taken up. And that problem was that we needed to not only be allowed to be free from external right wing oppression and suppression of speech from the right, but we needed to develop freedom internally, both in our own heads and as the left. That we needed to be able to free ourselves from the concern. One of the concerns about is to be right from the start, to presume that our position is correct and shouldn't be challenged even by our own thinking. And that is something that I think has taken hold across the culture and certainly in the left, which is we already know what the right answers are. The question before us is why aren't these answers being taken up?
Right.
And
Or what to do
that,
about the people who disagree, or are quote unquote
right,
wrong about it. Yeah.
right. How to defend ourselves from the wrong people, how to combat the wrong opinions, um, and how to defend our rights to say the true things, right? And I said, look, there are a lot of things that we don't fully understand, and we don't give ourselves the freedom to rethink them or to think them about them together in any serious way. And I raised the question of the war in Palestine and the occupation
Mm.
of the Palestinian people. And I was like, as an example, I have not heard a single leftist really discuss in any serious way why Trump's ceasefire fell apart. It's all that we're told about that as well. The Israelis didn't want it to continue, and they are evil Zionists, and so of course it fell apart. Uh, it was a bad faith offer from the beginning, which is a way to say we don't have to think about what's actually happening in Palestine and Israel. Not to say that you should defend the Israelis, but rather just, there were multiple things that were actually being discussed within that ceasefire agreement and around the region. For instance, getting the Arab states to provide security for an effort to rebuild, and also, conversations about, of course, the hostages being released, but also future governance that became a stumbling block because of the different aims of both major parties. The Israelis wanted to absolutely destroy and remove Hamas from power. Hamas wanted to maintain, particularly its military ability, military might, and that was, irreconcilable. That was why the ceasefire fell apart. It was because Israel wouldn't withdraw from the region until Hamas disarmed. Hamas would not disarm probably at all, but if they were to, it would only be conditional upon the Israeli retreat. And of course, once the Israelis retreated, then the likelihood of Hamas disarmament declined, and so it wasn't a catch-22 situation. And without facing that, then you have no way of thinking about even how it might have been overcome, right? And so we, as a left, aren't capable of just that level of thought for the most part. And I haven't, and now I feel a little guilty because I haven't thought much beyond that about that issue myself. But I've tried a little bit, and I can't come up with I don't have a plan. I don't know how to end the war in Gaza. I don't. But at least I can admit that much.
Right. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that issue in particular and how it feels like I live in between alternate universes where I have some of the most intelligent people in my life saying that the biggest problem in the world is anti-Semitism right now. And at the same time, obviously, a lot of people are very concerned about the genocide. And I'm just and it's just there's a complete collapse between these worlds. And then, I'm also like around my parents a lot more now, and they're Trump supporters, and uh, and for them, they're just like, no, anti-Semitism is a serious issue right now, and also it's not a genocide, and uh, eh, but I've been tuning into Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and in particular, Tucker just had on that Josh guy who was on the Joe Rogan Experience, who had that not debate with Douglas Murray.
Oh
Did you
yeah,
see that when that happened? Yeah, that
yeah. I saw a
Josh.
little bit of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was funny, right? And so Tucker had that guy on, and then he also had on Glenn Laurie, the conservative
Yeah,
black intellectual.
I've interviewed him in the past.
You
Glenn
have?
Loury.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah. He's smart. I like him.
Yeah, Brianna Joygray just had him on recently as well, because so what he's talking about is how the Manhattan Institute pulled their funding from his podcast because of his position on Palestine. And really, his position is it's just basic. It's just like, hey, this is messed up. That's all he's saying. Like, you can't say that without having people come out after you. But what I'm getting at is that, well, in the case of those three, Tucker, Candace, and Glenn, that's three people who have huge reach and influence in conservative spaces that are challenging Trump, that are challenging U.S. foreign policy on backing Israel with Gaza right now. And
Hmm.
so I find that fascinating. And there, for Glenn Loury, he's like, yeah, this puts me in agreement with Ta-Nehisi Coates. You know, that's what he'll say. He says, look, he's like, I disagree with Ta-Nehisi Coates in a million ways all the time. But when he writes about Palestine, he's mostly right. You know,
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I would have to see what Glenn Lowry has to say, right? And really, um, so there's a problem. Like, I don't think that the conservatives who are advocating for the Palestinians against the Israelis are doing a better job of actually thinking than the leftists who do that on campus at Columbia. I certainly don't think Douglas Murray is any kind of thinker on this issue either, right? He's a fucking monster when it comes to this stuff. But and obviously his aim around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is to shut down thinking. Um, so neither side is actually taking it up as a problem to be solved between by society. Instead, there are political factions representing interests to have their own talking points and perspectives, and from that vantage point, it's simply a matter of picking sides as to who you think is more wrong or who is more right or what have you. And it's not going to be
right.
solved that way. It just isn't. It's going to be perpetuated that way.
So you're not sure how it would be solved, but you're sure it wouldn't be solved that way.
Yeah. I mean, okay. When I think through why the Palestinians continue to be bombed and starved and live in such absolute now in this point in rubble an area that is by the UN has been described as uninhabitable. Why is that the perpetuation of that the easiest thing? Why is that the solution everyone can agree on? Because that's what's happening right now. Everyone can agree that the continuation of the Palestinian suffering is what's preferable. So why are they all agreeing on that? Well, it's because there is no force in society right now that works outside of the logic of not just capital, but a particular kind of statist capitalism. Meaning, you have
Nationalist?
you have these nations that all have their own interests. They're not like nationalists in the sense of they're not all nationalists in the sense of saying, well, the most important thing is America first, and we're gonna, worry about our imports and exports,
Right.
or we're gonna stop immigration, or we're gonna whatever. No, it's not like that. It's just like each nation has its own interests and its own internal problems. So each nation is very concerned about maintaining its legitimacy and authority as a nation.
Right.
And to, for example, for the Egyptians to put troops into Gaza as an alternative security force to the Israelis and help with the disarmament of Hamas and facilitate a process where maybe some of Hamas might be part of some coalition government coming out of the Palestinian Authority. For them to do that, they would face internal pressure from their own population and the risk of a conflict with other players like Iran and Hamas in Gaza. So it is not in the Egyptian state's interest to intervene in such a way that they could actually transform the situation in Gaza. It is in their interests to wait and see and to let other players, you know, take the lead. It's not in the interest, certainly, of the Israelis to withdraw. And they're not wanting to facilitate any kind of coalition government that could actually cohere in Palestine. The Israelis' aim is to defeat the Palestinian movement altogether and to dominate the region as a nation of by and for the Jewish population through Zionism, which, by the way, is not even that beneficial to all Jews in the nation. They've been before October 7th. There was already an internal crisis within the Israeli state on the level of civil liberties and separation of power. and how to govern. Benjamin Netanyahu is facing massive street protests from Israelis because he was trying to overcome the limits that were placed on him by the court system in Israel. So internally, the Israeli state is struggling to maintain itself. Um, and then you can just, throw a rock. Each player, the United States, has been worn down through conflicts in the region. It is not wanting to deploy a lot of troops in Gaza or in the region. And more importantly, that particular issue is such a fraught one because it involves the Israeli, uh, Arab conflict and symbolizes so much that to go in and really take a firm hand and occupy would set up all sorts of reprisals and would break all sorts of agreements with other nations where you have this sort of quasi stalemate balance of power. So it's in everyone's interests for things to continue at this level of misery for these people. The only people whose interest is that it is not in are the same people who were protesting against Netanyahu, the same Palestinians who wanted to find work in Israel, the same Americans who want to make America great again, some of them, who are looking for jobs to come back. Those people might get it together as a class and have an ability to coordinate their efforts to pressure each one of these states in a direction that would be in the benefit of all. So I think that not that we need a socialist revolution overnight, but we need at least a political party that represents the interests of the class of workers in all of these states if we're going to actually make any headway. None of the capitalist states are ever going to solve this problem in any humane way. I mean, maybe we can imagine some sort of, we can imagine two scenarios. One is somehow the Middle Eastern, the Arab nations get it together and just wipe out Israel. And the United States is weakened by China and Russia, can't defend Israel, and there could be a war where one side just absolutely is devastated and loses, or vice versa, which is more likely scenario. It looks like right now, Israel just slowly wipes out the Palestinians. Not like kills them all, but just makes it impossible for there to even be a movement for self-government there any longer. That could happen too.
They've probably already achieved that, but that's, I
At
guess,
least
arguable. But
they've achieved that in Gaza. They haven't achieved that in the West Bank. But yeah.
Yeah. Now this relates back to liberalism, I think, in the sense that when we're thinking about liberalism, typically we think of individuals with individual rights, and those are rights for the pursuit of happiness, which includes self-expression and the kind of religion that you want to practice, and then, but also freedom from oppression, right? And and this, I mean, of course, oppression in the sort of HR bureaucratic world that we live in today just means discomfort, of course, and that's why it's kind of an annoying word, is because we're not talking about the revolutionary subject. We're talking about the pacified consumer subject, right? That's what the intersectional subject is usually just the satisfied customer, like which kind of customer requires a little bit more effort to keep satisfied. And the activism that comes off of campuses is about, that in particular. It's not revolutionary. But then beyond the individual, though, there is this interesting question about the role of the nation. And it seems like the lesson of the 20th century, and maybe this is a little bit of a hot take, but I'm going to just say it seems like one of the lessons of the 20th century is that nations, even if they're not real, they're about as much collectivity as a human is able to participate in without being an intellectual. Which is to say, if you're an intellectual, you can, in a very big-brained way, be a part of a universalist worker movement. But if you are a little bit more simple, you're the kind of guy who drives around with two flags on the truck. If you're a little bit more tough guy, sports, sports and family, you're a lot more susceptible to a kind of collectivity that can't go beyond the scope of something. There's like a reach of immediacy that you can stay within, and it's like the nation state seems to be the limit of how far you can take your collectivity. Maybe the church would be another example, even though of course most people are really just in a relation to their local church, not the church as an idea, which is once again an intellectualist abstraction. And
I,
so,
I I think you've got it backwards.
okay,
I think that everyday people who are not intellectuals have a much easier time not only understanding but also really directly participating in the totality of our society, which is international. And the intellectuals struggle to understand what is actually happening in a way that working people and everyday people don't. And here's why. You go to work, you're working in a company that most of the time uh, trades with, produces for other companies, and those other companies trade with and produce for other companies, and that network of relations spreads across the world.
right.
So you're already like directly participating in a global society, in a global project, just by going to work. That's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing I'd say is by acting as an individual for your own rights, you are already struggling for everyone else as well. That you don't have to worry about caring about the folk practices of some backwards Chinese man and like studying hard about what is the religion of Islam, or paying penance for the your ancestors' bad deeds in order to already be involved in common struggle with people around the world just by standing up for your rights as an individual, because it's the same rights that the Palestinians want, and it's the same rights that the Israeli people want, and it's the same rights that your trans neighbor wants. It's not, they're not different rights. They're the same basic rights, which is the right to freely associate, to work, and to make your own future, and to be free enough to pursue your own happiness. That's what everybody wants, and everyone's struggling to achieve. So I don't think that it's that tricky. I think most people already are engaged with it and know that the nationalism thing, that's a problem when, and it's happening all the time also, when one nation is set up against another, and that conflict becomes one where it's easier for some people to get their rights than others. And there's also when there's no political way for people as individuals to help other individuals to achieve those rights, then yeah, then you get sucked into the nationalist projects or wars or what have you. But it's being done on the basis of defending your rights even then. So
What right? So, I mean, because we're talking about very different rights with the list that you just went through, right? Like, now I can think of trans people I know in the real world who just want to be left alone, for instance. But as a movement, it's not a movement of people who just want to be left alone. As a movement at the level of advocacy, it is one where uh, a lot more than being left alone is at stake. We're talking about this should be taught in schools. We're talking about gender reassignment and identity affirmation being something that gets enshrined at the level of institutions. Those kind of rights are not the kinds of rights that most people think about wanting on a regular basis. And in fact, these kind of super niche identitarian rights that are being mainstreamed are highly divisive to the point where I think it either depoliticizes people or politicizes them in a way that doesn't bring people together.
yeah, I mean, I threw the trans category in um where in a way that I was redefining their struggle at the same time I mentioned them. I was not
Oh,
accepting, and it was a tricky thing for me to do. and in my mind, I imagine trans people objecting, but certain trans activists, because what I'm saying is ultimately what trans people want is the freedom to freely associate, to have a job, to have the right to a home, to be treated with enough respect to be able to set their own course and to determine their own happiness. That's
Sure.
what they really want. But then along the way, in an effort, in a struggle to get those rights under the conditions they're in, which has to do with feeling uncomfortable with their body and wanting and their identity and wanting to change it and be recognized in a different way, um, as the opposite gender often. Uh, Along the way, they then have turned to the state to enforce rules that impose on others' rights,
Right.
and that just happens all the time. Whenever you're struggling as a particular identity, and I would suggest to trans people that they think about things more universally than they do, and try to develop politics that would defend their rights while defending others, rather than thinking of it as a matter of their own unique identity that they're defending, but rather
Hmm.
just their rights as an individual. So, like, it's often raised to me, well, cis people have the right to get cosmetic surgery if they want to make their breasts bigger, or to make their nose
Right.
smaller, or or take testosterone to make themselves bulky or whatever. They do these things. So why is that not opposed? And my answer is, well, it's actually much more regulated than and less. It's not advocated for in the same way that trans procedures are. You're not going to find a doctor who, or an organization that will claim, oh, if you don't give a young woman breast implants, she'll kill herself. And therefore,
Right.
if a woman comes in for breast implants, you
Right.
must pay for it through the state or through private insurance, and you must expedite that process. If you're, like, no,
Right.
no, that doesn't happen. Um, so, in fact, if you wanted to reduce trans medicine to the level of cosmetic surgery, most trans advocacy groups would see that as a defeat. But it might not be such a bad thing, because then the question would be fought out on the level of, what about just everyone's right to individual expression? If I want to be goth, I can be goth, and I shouldn't face restrictions on where I can work and where I can live, or whether I can have a family based on being goth, and I shouldn't be facing those restrictions because I cross dress in whichever direction either.
Right. Like right now, there's not any sort of serious repercussions for me or anyone else to speak out against Botox culture and nose jobs and boob jobs, which I think are fucking disgusting and bullshit in almost all cases. I've seen like videos of someone who's got like just like
Wait
a
until you get to be 54. I'm considering the Botox. I got these
oh my god.
eyelids are drooping down. I think maybe I'll get the Botox. Go
Look,
ahead.
I said in almost all cases, and of course, we shouldn't probably live our lives in deference to extreme exceptions. But like, what I don't like are my, when I was teaching at the university, having students who are 18 years old who are going for Botox and feeling like this is necessary to be beautiful, when in reality, if they just tried to cultivate a personality at all and get off their phones a little bit, like that would get them a lot further than these surgeries, right? And so,
I don't
but guess what?
disagree, but that's so
But
funny
I
to me
can,
to hear you say
but
that. Go
I
ahead.
can say that. I can say that. Or
Mhm.
Anne on what's right. Anne has expressed repeatedly her feelings about women being sold this dream of looking younger and sort of like the surgeries that come with that, and how those surgeries aren't really going to cash out. Even if it does help you a little bit for a little while, it doesn't really work out long term. And you can look at the actresses who get a lot of this, and at a certain point they're not able to be expressive in their faces anymore. They can't even do, like, watch what I'm doing with my eyebrows. Like, for people listening only, you can't see, but I'm like raising my eyebrows and it moves my forehead when I do it. That's
Yeah.
part of like human
I
expression. After a certain point, you lose that ability, and you start to look more and more like Michael Jackson, right? It's like people are being sold this idea that that's going to work.
Hmm.
and it's terrible. My point though is that I can say this without expecting any serious repercussions, but
Hmm.
obviously as soon as you get to the trans issue, there is a lot more uh of an attitude of like, no, you can't really talk about that. You're not really supposed to talk about it. So, yeah.
Right. I had a guy on the podcast called, what was his name? His name's Phil. I forget his last name, but he wrote a book about autogynephilia,
Oh yeah.
and he's an autogynephile by
Okay,
his
yeah.
own self-definition. And he was wearing a dress when I was interviewing him, but he hadn't taken any hormones or wasn't trying to pass. And I asked him why he didn't consider himself to be trans or why he wasn't trying to pass. And he says, "Well, I'm 6'5". The chance of me passing is almost nothing. I'm just too tall to really ever pass as a woman.
But the autogonophiliac's not trying to. I thought they're not trying to pass. I didn't because it's not about dysphoria. It's about the
Oh no, no, no. Well, he explained it all to me. Like autogynephilia is actually, according to him, what most trans women have. Especially if you're talking about a trans woman who is attracted to women, you're talking about an autogonophile. That's someone who
right,
is erotically excited by and attached to the notion of their own themselves as a woman, and it can
right.
be so strong that erotic fixation that it becomes uncomfortable, even
Oh,
traumatic, to
okay.
to be a man. And you got to think of it like this: we all libidinize ourselves. We all uh, fundamentally want to be libidinally successful. Like if I thought I was truly horrific and had no absolutely zero sex appeal, like it would bother me. It would really bother
Right.
me. I know that it may be the case, but I don't believe it. And and um and so the so when these men who really are attached to themselves erotically as as women uh feel like they're not women, that they have to face they're not women, it is uh wounding in a way that if you really walked around feeling like you were tremendously ugly would be maybe even more wounding than that. And so that is a very difficult reality for them to face. So it's not just that they're like sexually excited by the idea of themselves as women, but they're
Which is
erotically
what I
attached.
thought. Right.
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 They're also erotically attached. Like it's to become part of their core identity at that point through that erotic attachment is what Phil said. And okay, so like I think that's interesting and that happens and some autogonophile say when I face that this is what's happening, I can more easily accept the sense of discomfort that comes when I'm not dressed as a woman, and I can even transition away. I can detransition or only cross dress in particular circumstances as a part of maybe my private sex life. This is an option for me at that point when I face my autogynephilia, but it's not. I wouldn't say that any trans woman who's autogynephilic has to do that, or there's any
Right.
obligation to do that. It might be liberating to do that. It might not be, um, but that's how I understand trans trans women for the most part, especially like I said, those who are trans lesbians. You know,
Right. Right.
right?
Right. Right.
Where and the other side of it, I are men who uh, want to be women because they're gay, and even they may be somewhat autogynephilic. I don't really know, but
Well, then that opens up a few other avenues as well, which is the misdiagnosed autistic person who's dealing with homophobia and it's easier to be trans, or the parents would prefer that they were trans. There's all kinds of things there. But then also just like you have a public school culture right now where tomboys do not exist. If you are less feminine and a girl, um, on the one hand, you're going to get put into this category, but also there's actual social, short-term social benefits to identifying a different way. And I'm not a autogynephilia. I didn't get off on wearing dresses, but I did enjoy the social privileges or sort of sense of power that comes from it, because in a progressive environment, if you walk in a dress and you're a dude, if you walk in a dress, like you kind of have like sway in that room in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I was, at the point that I was doing that, it was 2 years after uh, being a normal hetero-cis dude in progressive spaces who was advocating for Bernie. And that was agonizing because people don't take you seriously, or they think that your job is to shut up and take, bend the knee. And so like putting on the dress, it's like, who gets to talk now? You know what I mean? And I didn't
Dave, I
see
was
it.
so irritated by you when I saw you show up in a dress. I just want to tell you that. I didn't say it at the time. I tried to be, politically correct, and it was exactly for that reason. It was like,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this fucking guy, he's figured out, he's cracked the code and he's willing to do it. He's bending the fucking knee.
Yeah.
And he's congratulating himself as he does it. That's what I thought at the time.
Oh man. Yeah,
Because
well.
no, because you were like, okay, I will sacrifice my actual, inclinations, what I would probably do, and adopt a costume to fit into this fucked up little lefty scene, and in order to get points in it. And I was like, yeah, okay, not necessary, but it's your business, whatever you wanted to do. It's not like I thought not wearing a dress was, the morally correct thing to do. It just seemed to me that you weren't trans, or you weren't an onogonophile. I could kind of tell you weren't an onogonophile, like it wasn't something
Yeah.
you didn't carry it in a particular, you didn't try to pass and or change your manners or anything. It was just like, it was like watching Milton Berle. You know who that is? Milton Berle?
No.
Milton, but yeah, it's a very old reference. He was like one of the first TV stars, and he was a comedian, and he would do a lot of acts in drag. He would like
Okay.
dress up like a woman for a laugh. So anyway, I'm sorry.
Well, so like I'll just say, like, I definitely didn't see myself as doing that. It's easy for me to now in retrospect say that was probably a part of it, because I can say that at the level of how it felt to be in a room, it was nice to not be sort of default for just put off as like the white dude or whatever, right? But that only works in extreme niche kind of blue, especially academic kind of
Mm-hmm.
spaces. But from the standpoint that I was in at the time, no, I genuinely was naive enough to believe that that was that gender queering kinds of activities are just a part of like what we have to do to undermine the kind of the gender norms that are so oppressive. I actually thought that these are very oppressive things. And I would talk about it even then. Like, yeah, I grew up in a place where if you don't kill a deer, you're not a real man. And I just found that kind of gender shit absolutely ridiculous. Right.
Yeah, I didn't come from that background, but I have talked to men who, who went through a period where they thought they were non-binary, or who did come from that background, and they would say like, I go home and I'm in this macho culture, and it makes me feel like I'm not a real man. So maybe I'm non-binary, or maybe I'm a real
Right.
girl or something like that. But then I'd say, well, and I said, well, when you think about dating, who would you want to date? What gender would you want to date? And they said, well, I don't care what the gender is. It's okay. What kind of what kind of body would you want to be with? And a female bodied person. I said, okay, so listen, let me break it to you. You're a white, straight male. You may
Yeah,
not be as macho as your dad, but nonetheless, look, you're in the philosophy department. Of course, you're not a real man,
yeah.
but you know, but you're still a man
Right,
anyway.
right, right. Well, and this is actually, related to, and I'll tie this back to liberalism in a minute, but I want to dwell on it
I
just a
feel like
little bit
all these are
longer.
very liberal attitudes that
No,
I'm just
yeah,
straightforwardly just
you
liberal.
you have a very liberal attitude about it, but also I think you would still get in trouble for some of the stuff you've already said, as obviously would I with certain people. But I want to take it back to this so curse. Giorno. Do you know about this this VTuber,
No,
Kirsch Giorno? So
VTuber? I don't even know what VTube is. That YouTube or something
I
else?
didn't know about it either, but basically they're people who they do streaming on Twitch and stuff like that, but instead of presenting like you are right now or like I am, they
Mm-hmm.
have an anime avatar that is that
Mm.
and so they're like an anime character that's a streamer, like that's what it means. And they're usually like, you know, a sexually attractive, whereas in real life they're not. And so
Sounds like a solution rather than the Botox for me. I could do
yeah,
this.
it totally is. Yeah. They could be like that dude from the movie Whale, you know,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
they'll have like the sexy anime avatar or whatever. And well, anyway, so that's what Kirsch Jorno does. Now, Kirsch Jorno is a trans woman who was hot stuff in I think Boston or whatever for a few years. Um, you know, when she first transitioned. But after a little while, she kind of just got pegged as this certain type of person, and so she realized she wasn't getting dates with anybody except for like the only people who wanted to hit on her were other trans women, and so it's like she was real. No. That's not even how it goes. Hold on, I'm trying to think. How did this go? I think it's no. What she realized was that only gay dudes wanted to be with her sometimes, but that none of the girls that she wanted to be with would be with her. So she's a lesbian, right? She's a trans woman lesbian. She wants to be with females, right? And she said that she was realizing that nobody wants to be with the trans women. Just nobody wants to be with the trans women. She doesn't want to be with the trans women either. She says this at the beginning of her article where she's kind of canceling all of these people that she's associating with. She says, well, I want to be with girls. But then she's basically taking offense to the fact that other people didn't want to be with her. And so, you know, she's not even aware. There's some kind of a contradiction here. She's not aware that other people not wanting to be with her, that she's offended by that, but yet she doesn't want to be with other trans women. She wants to be with hetero cis uh, women. And so it's like a weird thing. And I don't want to say that that's always the case or that, you know, they're always autogonophiliacs or they're always, or that the, you know, the only exception to that would be autistic person who's misdiagnosed, you know, gay or what have you.
I can solve the problem for this trans anime
Yeah, you
person.
solve it.
I can solve it. I got a solution. It's going to be more difficult than regular dating. But what you have to do, you go on one of these apps, right? And you set your category to non-binary, and you look for trans men or non-binary people who are female who want to be more masculine in some way, and who will feel politically obligated to not care about gender. And you can find women who will date you. You won't find lesbians who will, actual
Right.
lesbians, but you can find queer straight women who will date you if you're a trans woman. I really think you can. I think it will work. Even it might
It's
even work
possible.
for some of these young men who have such trouble dating with women, finding a girlfriend. I'll say without giving too much away, I know a young man who had a lot of trouble dating and then decided to become trans and got a girlfriend.
And
So
yep,
that
100%.
yeah
Yeah.
yeah
Well, and
yeah.
I know plenty of trans women who've got beautiful you know, girlfriends. And so it's very
But this
possible.
girlfriend says her pronouns are he him.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But
This is what you have to do to exist in progressive spaces now. This is
yeah,
what you have to do to be a progressive. You want to be straight, but you're going to have to do it with some extra steps, right? So I guess
right.
okay,
In
but
order
bringing
for
it
them to
back to
have a straight like a completely normal heterosexual relationship, he has to dress up like a woman and she has to
yeah.
dress up kind of like a guy, and then they can get
No,
it on. Otherwise,
it's
no.
like it's like a Monty Python joke or a Žižek joke, but it's real, right?
Right.
That's
Yeah.
how that's why it's weird, but that's where we are. And so bringing it back to liberalism then,
Hmm.
this is the self-actualized consumer getting to be whoever they want to be seen however they want to be. It's the dream of ultimate consumerism,
Mhm.
and it's being maxed out, and it can't be realized in a lot of cases. And a lot of people who try to realize it, well, it'll ruin their lives. And so it's that's a level of liberalism that I think cannot be sublated. That's ultimately what I want to bring it back to, is I think that there's all kinds of individualism that people are attached to today, and to try to sublate it is not going to work, right? Like,
Yeah,
because
but it's
we've been
not
sold
actual.
a false bill of goods.
It's not actually individualism. It's it's a category constructed by and managed by the administrative state. These are categories and roles prescribed to us by, let's say, starting off with academic institutions, going all the way up to the EU, um, international organizations like WPATH, the medical industry, the whole sprawling mess of the insurance industry. None of this has to do with your
The
individual
pharmaceutical
freedom.
industry as
The
well, yeah.
pharmaceutical industry, none of this has to do with your actual individual freedom, or the kind of freedom that you would be able to gain by organizing with others in society. It's actually just a matter of fitting with fitting in to the contradictory capitalist statist reality as it is now, and finding a role within it. So it's not liberal. It's actually very illiberal, and it ends up reaffirming a lot of the things that it claims to want to break from. Like, oh, I'm not as macho as my dad, therefore I'm not a man, therefore I'm a girl. I mean, come on, that's not liberal. That's
Right.
crazy reactionary.
It's not John Locke. it's,
Not John
it's not
Locke.
John Stuart Mill. Yeah.
No. All right.
Okay. So that would be your main argument, because that's what I've been thinking about a lot lately, is just like, well, it seems like almost everything about what it is to be a liberal subject is not something that is sustainable. It's not something that can continue. It's not, and I'm not just talking, obviously we really went into that example and we compared it to
Yeah, it's a live one.
women.
It feels real to us because it's all over the place. But yeah,
Right. But of course, if we're also talking about infinite body mods for women who are 50 years old and want to look like they're 22 or something like that, it's like, this is, if what people think of as individualism is their pleasure seeking being able to get its way and just get, it's sort of the hedonistic treadmill being maxed out, well then no, that's not gonna work.
it works by not working. It has been working for a long time, and it continues to work by not working. None of these things are meant to last. Fashions go through cycles. Shorts are long. I mean, skirts are long and then short. What was a cool way to think 10 years ago is out of step now. And they're not designed to be sustained. None of this is designed to be sustainable. It's designed to break down, but break down in controlled ways so that something else from the same apparatus can emerge to replace it. Um, and sometimes what emerges next is better, more pleasurable, more interesting than what came before. Um, so there is a kind of progress through it all, but it also eats itself and turns back on itself. Um, but yeah, it's not meant to be sustained. Not
Yeah.
on that level. That's why like things stay exactly the same and yet they're changing all the fucking time. That's this. That's what that is.
Right.
And it's
That's the
not
sort of
liberalism that's the fault of that. Really the problem. It's the way in which there's a crisis going because of, I'm going to say it, capitalism, that then is handled and administrated and managed into a controlled perpetual breakdown.
so, but isn't individualism, liberalism, and capitalism, aren't all three of these things intimately related to one another, because we're being reduced to the commodity form? Like, the point is our reduction to a constant source of self-valorizing labor power that is obviously being cultivated by giant corporations and bureaucracies and states that need us to be as exchangeable as possible, but also as predictable as possible. And so us staying at the level of self-valorizing, rational, or in the sense of pleasure-seeking creatures, like this does make us uh, more exchangeable in the sense of like, yeah, we better fit into the commodity form. And that's not something that can be sublated, is it?
Well, I think it can be, yeah, but I think it's the trickiest one to sublate. But what is the ultimate, most important commodity in society?
The laborer.
Right, labor power. That is the primary commodity. It's the one that has a secret. It produces the rest of the values in society. That the consumption of that, unlike the consumption of a Big Mac, when you consume labor power, you actually end up with more than you started with.
Right.
So,
Or at least insofar as it's making a profit, the corporation in that case does.
yeah,
Yeah.
right, yeah. It generates the labor power is worth a certain amount, and if it's going to stay in the market and actually be purchased again and again, it has to the actual real labor, the physical labor, the useful labor that it does has to produce more value than it takes to sustain. That's what the labor power does. So it's like how wages work. It's like your wage isn't worth what you're worth, what your work is worth. It's always worth just what all the other laborers have contributed to make the things that you need to be able to continue to work yourself. So yeah, so anyhow, so workers as are commodities. Your work is your commodity. It's the one commodity that theoretically we're all supposed to, fully own and control our own work and our own bodies, right? So, how do we sublate that as workers? Well, not by quitting our jobs, not by going on the dole, not by demanding universal basic income, not by automating the need for work away, but by to like in the way that a capitalist would, by like working with together with other workers to represent the interests of workers and like trying to set some price fixing in place so nobody can be hired for under a certain amount. No one, and agree to uh, avoid certain conditions, so that nobody can be made to do a certain kind of work.
Sure.
Um, and by collectively making those demands, and then beyond that, demanding state power in order to be able to really enforce your class's needs and desires, will you can the idea from Marxism is you will be then in a position to actually have the power as a class to go beyond being a commodity in this system by fully realizing your power. You will take up the power you already are, the power that runs the world. Take that up self-consciously. Your work is the most important commodity in society. It's the one that sets the terms for all the others. Uh, if you work together collectively to really enforce that power and realize it completely, you'll be able to go beyond the terms of it. That's the idea of sublating labor.
Yeah. Well, I hope it works out for you. I'll come back to this later with you, maybe in maybe when we next talk. But the post class fractured mass
You,
thesis, the potato class fractured mass here,
right.
I think what it's going to say is that beyond the ways that we're the same because of the commodity form when it comes to labor power, the difference that makes it so irreconcilable or intractable, as Benjamin would say, is consumer habitus, consumer practice, consumer niche preferences. That's where it becomes a lot more difficult. But of course, I'm not giving up hope. You haven't given up hope. There are ways to circumnavigate it, or at least we should assume that there will be. So
I feel as though a lot of the objections that we get on that level, the turn away from this insight and the need to sublate labor, uh, is um, is actually just the major impediment to it, rather than some other objective fact about the world being the impediment. It's our own uh, d- lack of desire to actually see it through. It is, I think that all that stuff is a way to avoid the problem because it's risky, right? And it hasn't worked out so well in the past to make this effort. Um, and some of us aren't actually workers. Some of us are not selling our labor power to survive. So um, it feels like we'd be we'd be giving up something to see that happen. So I mean, there are a variety of ways in which I think that we duck um, the somewhat obvious conclusions like the ones I've put forward today, including me, including a lot of people who call themselves Marxists, like most. Um, but I just that's my feeling about it right now is that it's actually not that hard conceptually. It is very difficult in reality, but
right.
it could be it. But it's also that difficult thing to do in reality is really the only thing that will possibly provide a path where, just to take again to go back to Gaza, where some other outcome rather than the sustained uninhabitable misery in Gaza will be the easiest thing to do. Without at least working in that direction, I'm not saying even fully achieving it, there will not be any other way to negotiate something like that conflict.
I think it's seeing that I if I say this, it would open the door for a whole other conversation that we can't have right now. But I'll just say that Gaza and ultimately Israel, and really what we're talking about is Zionism, gets at the heart of one of the other things that happened in the 20th century that forever broke the feasibility for, something that, was the condition of possibility for the Second International to reach the level of power that it did. There's all these other aspects that we have
Like
discussed.
what did it break?
How to say this? Socialists used to have Jews. We'll just say that. And what happened in in World War II is, well, really between World War I and World War II is almost all of them were killed, and the ones who won were the right winger ones, right? And so Zionism won, Bolshevism lost. And I don't know if you know about the paper that Churchill wrote called Bolshevism or Zionism, and he's saying like, look, there's Jews make up one of the strongest constituencies or power groups in the world, and you have to work with them, right? And well, there's two ways that's going. One is Bolshevism, and the other one is Zionism. Here's the reasons we don't want to go with Bolshevism. Obviously, it's going to mess up everything for our labor force. So what we want then is to take the side of the Zionists. That's what we have to do, and that's what Churchill said, and that's what he set out to do. And it's not, and this is not conspiracy theory. You can look up the paper where he says it, and then also, and I found out about that paper like 3 weeks ago, but I've known for years though that he grew up spending his summers at the houses of all these other aristocrats, and one of the families in particular was the most powerful Zionist family that had an interest in obviously getting its homeland, and that was the Rothschilds. And so Churchill grew up hanging out with them, during the summertime.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not surprising then that he says, well, we're gonna want to take the side of the Zionists, not the Rosa Luxemburgs, right? And of course, Hannah Arendt in her speech that she gave
Yeah,
on
but I
Rosa
mean, Rosa
Luxemburg.
Luxemburg was before that, right? When
No, yeah, that's why I said between World War I and II. But this is all part of the same thing, sorting itself out in the 20th century, and or at least that's what I'm claiming. And Arendt, in her speech that she gave on Luxembourg, she says Luxembourg was naive because she thought that this sort of universalist approach that she embraced was just a natural thing that a human could reach through empathy and a little theory. But what, and this is Arendt saying this, what Luxembourg did not realize was that that was in part a product of her Jewishness, that her Jewishness made her especially fit for being able to have this particular universalist politics, and she was projecting that out as a possibility for everybody else. And Arendt's saying this as somebody who took herself to be German up until they tried to kill her for being Jewish, and then she said that she kind of realized the hard way that she is Jewish, right? And so it's a rude awakening for her because she just saw herself as a German up until she was like, "Oh, I'm not. I can't be. Oh shit." And so what I'm saying is that when one of the most powerful uh, blocks of humans spread out across the world with a tradition in literary interpretation. That's one of the admirable things about Judaism, is that it's very textually based, right? Like instead of having roots in soil, their roots were in texts. Well, once you actually do give them soil, at least a portion of the group, once you do give it soil, well, you've officially undermined the thing that made it so that so many of them had this proclivity towards internationalism and this sort of universalism. So I'm not saying that that makes it impossible to do socialism, but I'm saying the 20th century is the story of killing the socialist leaning Jew and instead setting up the Zionist uh, contingency.
Well, all I'll say, and I double checked this while you were, I asked my newest friend,
Grok.
ChatGPT.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I talked to Grok too, but he and I have had a falling out. I like ChatGPT; she's nice to me. Um, but I asked, so this piece, Zionism versus Bolshevism, you mentioned that Churchill wrote. It was written before he was prime minister, and in 1920, as you point out. Of course, Rosa Luxemburg had been dead for a year or more, just about a little over a year, when he wrote that piece. And more importantly, Churchill did have to deal with Bolshevism and partner with it.
Right. But he didn't want it to win in the long term.
Right. But it did well enough that
Well,
during World War II,
none of the world
World War II,
leaders
the
did,
Bolsheviks
though.
had to come in and save Europe along with the United States from the Nazis. So Churchill might have preferred Zionism, and Zionism triumphed at the end, and has lasted longer than Bolshevism for sure. But also, he did partner with Bolshevism.
I
It's
I
just
I I also need to correct the record here in case anybody takes me for saying something that I'm definitely not saying. I'm not saying Bolsheviks were Jewish or that Bolsheviks were even predominantly Jewish, because they weren't. And that is actually a thing Nazis would say, is that Bolshevism is a Jewish conspiracy. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that,
but it was a
the
major tendency within the Jewish. If the Jews were,
community.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
That
No,
is
I
what I'm
understood
saying.
what you
Yeah.
meant. Yeah,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
but um, my point. First of all, it's a weird comparison ultimately to Zionism or Bolshevism, but actually though the point I would say is by the time Churchill wrote Zionism or Bolshevism, Bolshevism had already it's like was on its way out. It was failing in 1920. The when Rosa Luxemburg ended up dead in Germany, Bolshevism had already like been killed to a degree, right? And certainly before World War II, it was defeated.
Well,
And
we
what was
could
left
talk
was
about
those
actually
colonies.
existing Bolshevism in a sort of. I think what you're doing is correct, but also the way I'm using the term, and I think the way Churchill is using it in that piece, is not as literally this party, but is instead this tendency which is the professional
Right.
revolution, the professional revolutionary universalist worker tendency. That's what he has in mind.
Right. And all I would say is that that tendency is is not just a fact that is the same throughout history, but like there's what does Bolshevism mean to Churchill in 1920? What did Bolshevism mean to Churchill in 1941? What did Bolshevism mean in 1918 in Germany? What did it mean in the Soviet Union in 1928?
Well,
You
right.
know,
No,
yeah.
him working with Stalin, it strategically for a while is different from his idea of the trajectory of history and the sort of paths that can be opened up or foreclosed. And right. And
But you
the
have to ask,
goal,
like, why did he
whether
oppose Bolshevism in 1920? Why did he accept it as at least a potential partner for a time in 1941? Was it really the same Bolshevism, even from Churchill's perspective, at both times? Um, was Bolshevism by the time? I mean, certainly Bolshevism was no longer the major threat on the world stage during World War II. Much more
no,
cooperative with the other capitalist powers than the
right.
fascists were. So, it's just like we can't think about these ideologies as strictly speaking, like they're not little identity groups that just remain throughout history. They're not like they are ideas that are worked out through struggle, that change through struggle, get defeated for a time, and
No, but
so
no. Well, I think what I'm trying to get at though is that Israel and the sort of reductionism that you get from existing states where they just say it's Israel all or nothing. I'm saying that outside of the individual intentions of people, the lesson of the 20th century was we have to give the Jewish people a homeland, and it must be defended at all costs because otherwise working class revolutions will happen. So I'm just saying that there is this, it's a lot easier to look at the situation and go, well, what does Netanyahu think, and what does Trump really think, and well, why do people really? I'm just saying, outside of
yeah, right.
individual intentions, there is
I
this Zionism and giving Jews a homeland became an absolute all or nothing sort of lesson from the 20th century that has been institutionalized beyond the level of individual intentions.
my understanding of history, and I'm not a historian, but my understanding of history is a little different. It's not that what defeated Bolshevism was Churchill, but
Well,
rather
I'm using
it
him as an
was.
example.
Hold on, it was actually the Marxists themselves, the Social Democratic Marxist Party in Germany, that would be ultimately responsible for the defeat of Bolshevism. It is the crisis within Marxism itself that was the self-defeat of Bolshevism, not the capitalist powers that smashed it from outside. That's what I think. So the problem is not an externality, and in the same way that the crisis within bourgeois society and modernity isn't a crisis of some backward forces stopping bourgeois society from functioning properly. It's a crisis within bourgeois society itself. It's the self-defeat of bourgeois society, of liberalism, say. So we have to try to overcome our own self-defeat. It's not a matter of the imperial nations making the decision. That decision had been made before Churchill wrote Zionism versus Bolshevism. That's what I would say.
That's a good last word to leave you off on here. Thanks, Doug.
All right.
We can come
All right.
back to this anytime, but yeah, I appreciate having you on. It's good to have
Yeah.
you back. Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Yep.
Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, from Chris Catrone to Michael Downs, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars. and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. A one-off course here or there is one thing, but Theory Underground is a school of thought, and it has research in motion. It is a process of development, generating some of the most revolutionary, transformative, or radical ideas coming out of the theory scene. If you are interested in the critique of the old and new left, but also a critique of postmodernism and metamodernism, and you want to go beyond all of that to something that is conserving and fighting in defense of the human, well, Theory Underground is where it's happening. Between authors like Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, as well as American authors like Postman and Illich and Lasch, Barry, or underrated thinkers like Hannah Arendt, what we do is draw off of the history of philosophy, of political theory, of philosophy of nature, all the way up to the current contemporary debates or fundamental divisions within the theory scene between the Ljubljana School and the CCRU, Žižek and Land, and we say, no, we are here to stand up for the human, to defend meaning in the face of impossible odds. This is the anti-nihilist side of the theory scene. This is the pro-natalist side of the theory scene. This is the neither left nor right side of the theory scene. And it's all being organized by me, David McKerracher. I built this because there's nowhere else on the internet to get what I need, and there's other people who magically get something out of that as well, and they are making this possible right now by subscribing. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet, to work through these things, and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. Not to become a little online hater who just uses theory to manipulate other people and confirm your biases. No, Theory Underground is something else. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer, then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today. Thank you.